A racist police officer brazenly kicked an elderly black veteran to the ground, leaving him in pain and humiliation. However, shortly after, when the veteran's true identity was revealed, the officer's life spiraled into chaos. What could cause someone who seemed to stand at the height of power to face such a bitter reckoning? Watch the full story to uncover the truth, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, never to miss more profound and unexpected lessons. The scorching afternoon sun made the atmosphere in the parking lot of Thompson's Grocery feel more oppressive than usual. The glaring sunlight beamed down on the tightly packed cars, reflecting off their windows and illuminating the cracks in the asphalt. People moved back and forth, some rushing with heavy bags of groceries, others stopping to search for shaded parking spots. At the edge of the lot, an older man strolled. William Carter, 72 years old, carried himself with quiet dignity. Though his small frame was unassuming, his bearing exuded calm and self-respect. His clothes, though old, were neatly pressed, and he wore a black hat embroidered with the words "Vietnam Veteran" in bold golden thread. He held a paper bag containing a few essentials: bread, eggs, and a carton of milk for his daily breakfast. William approached an aging sedan, nearly as old as he was. Its paint was faded, but it gleamed in the sunlight, evidence of meticulous care. He reached into his pocket for his keys, preparing to unlock the car. Suddenly, the sound of heavy, hurried footsteps echoed across the lot, like the pounding of drums. A cold, authoritative voice rang out, "Hey, you! Step away from that car." William turned, his brows furrowing in confusion. Standing before him was a tall man in a police uniform, broad-shouldered with neatly cropped blonde hair. Officer Ryan Mitchell, 32 years old, strode toward him with a commanding presence. His hand rested lightly on his belt, near his baton and radio. William responded calmly, his voice steady and firm. "This is my car, officer. Is there a problem?" Ryan didn't seem to hear him. His eyes narrowed with suspicion, as though he believed William was hiding something. "Your car? I don't think so. Step back now. I don't want any trouble." The words stabbed at William's pride. Straightening his posture, despite the pain in his battle-worn shoulders, he replied, "You're mistaken. I haven't done anything wrong. This is my car. I parked it here before going into the store." Ryan took another step closer, his tone growing harsher. "Didn't you hear me? Step back now. I don't know what you're up to, but don't cause trouble here." Around them, people began to notice. Some stopped in their tracks, watching the confrontation with curiosity. A young man pulled out his phone, aiming the camera squarely at the unfolding scene. William maintained his steady gaze, his voice low but unwavering. "Young man, I fought for this country before you were even born. You have no right to treat me this way." Before William could say more, Ryan acted. With a swift, forceful kick, Ryan knocked William to the ground. The sound of William's body hitting the asphalt was sharp and painful. The paper bag he held flew out of his grasp, its contents scattering. The bread was crushed, the eggs shattered, and milk spilled in streaks across the hot pavement. William lay there, bracing himself with one hand against the ground, struggling to rise. His eyes reflected pain, not from his body, but from the insult. Ryan stood over him, his expression cold and arrogant. A murmur rippled through the growing crowd. "He kicked him! How could he do that to a veteran?" The phone cameras kept rolling. No one immediately stepped forward to help William, but the collective shock was palpable. A heavy silence blanketed the parking lot, broken only by William's faint groan as he tried to push himself up. This encounter was not just an injustice against an elderly man. It was a spark, ready to ignite the anger of an entire community. Ryan stood tall in the supermarket parking lot, his hand resting on his belt, his cold gaze scanning the crowd. In that moment, he saw more than just an elderly man struggling to get up from the ground. He saw the shadow of the rigid teachings that had been etched into his mind since childhood. Ryan Mitchell had grown up in a family of police officers, where honor was measured by rank and respect was earned through power. His father, John Mitchell, was a veteran officer known for his strict demeanor and unwavering adherence to the rules. During countless evenings after family dinners, John would recount tales of his days, teaching those who disrespected the law a lesson. "You must always be in control, Ryan," his father would say, his voice steady but carrying an undeniable weight. "People don't respect you naturally. You have to make them fear you. And if they don't fear you, they'll never respect you." Those words weren't just lessons, they were commands. As a boy, Ryan idolized his father as a hero, but as he grew older, he began to feel the burden of those expectations. Ryan was often forced into grueling training sessions designed by his father, from marksmanship drills to high-pressure scenarios. He was taught to act fast, decisively, without letting emotions interfere. But sometimes Ryan quietly questioned whether his father's teachings were truly right. As he entered adulthood, those questions grew louder. He realized that his father's behavior was not just strict but also deeply prejudiced. John Mitchell often spoke dismissively of people of color, viewing them as potential threats. Ryan didn't fully agree with his father, but years of living under such pressure had conditioned him to see the world through a black and white lens. In his mind, everything fell into two categories: those who were right and those who were wrong. The gray areas, people who weren't like him or who didn't follow the rules he believed in, became suspicious by default. Yet, deep within Ryan, there was a part of him that resisted this perspective. During his college years, he briefly considered abandoning the path of law enforcement altogether. But his father's shadow loomed too large. When Ryan graduated, John had already arranged for him to join the local police force, where John remained a revered figure. "You don't have another choice, Ryan. Our family is police, and so are you," his father had said when he noticed Ryan hesitating over the recruitment papers. Ryan never had the chance to escape that shadow. He entered the force with unresolved inner conflicts. He believed he was doing the right thing, maintaining order, but at times, like today, unconscious fears and anger from his past surfaced, driving his actions without thought. In the moment, Ryan kicked William Carter to the ground. He didn't just see an elderly man wearing a veteran's cap. He saw a threat, someone he needed to teach a lesson. But as the kick connected with William's body and the soft groans of pain filled the air, a flicker of awareness flashed in Ryan's mind. He looked down at the man struggling to stand, at the crowd recording the scene with their phones, and heard the murmurs. What did he just do? That man's a veteran. Ryan felt a tightness in his chest, though he didn't know how to respond. He was too accustomed to wearing a mask of authority, hiding his fears and vulnerabilities beneath it. He stood there, trying to maintain an air of superiority, but the growing unease inside him was undeniable. In his mind, his father's voice echoed again. "People won't respect you if they don't fear you." For the first time, Ryan questioned, "If they fear you, is that respect?" When Ryan Mitchell returned home after his shift, his mind was still spinning from what had happened in the parking lot. He tried to justify his actions, telling himself he was just doing his duty, but the emptiness in his heart was impossible to ignore. However, in an era where every moment can be captured and shared, the incident didn't end in the parking lot. The video of Ryan kicking William Carter was uploaded to the internet just hours later. The image of William, an elderly man wearing a hat embroidered with Vietnam veteran, lying on the ground amidst scattered groceries, facing Ryan, a young police officer with a cold expression, quickly captured public attention. Social media headlines began to emerge. Police officer kicks elderly black veteran in the parking lot. Is this how we treat someone who fought for our country? Justice for William Carter. Hashtags like #SureJustice for William and End Racism spread rapidly, turning the video into the center of a heated online debate. Many expressed outrage at Ryan's actions, calling it clear evidence of systemic racism in law enforcement. Others defended Ryan, arguing he was just doing his job and acted instinctively in a situation he perceived as threatening. The online backlash quickly spilled into the real world. In the town center, protest groups began to gather. Some held banners reading, "Justice for William Carter," "End police violence. Racism has no place in this community." Chants of "Justice now," mixed with the sound of wooden placards banging together, creating a tense atmosphere. However, not everyone stood on William's side. A smaller group, mostly comprising Ryan's acquaintances and police supporters, gathered nearby with countersigns. "Police are human too. Don't judge Ryan Mitchell so quickly." The tension escalated as the two groups clashed, shouting heated arguments at one another. A small, peaceful town was quickly turning into a battleground of division. At the town hall, bright lights illuminated the chamber as local officials convened an emergency meeting. The pressure weighed heavily on Mayor Susan Whitmore, who stood before a room filled with staff, advisors, and community representatives. "We need a strategy," she said, her tone urgent but composed. "This situation is spiraling out of control. If we don't handle this carefully, it could turn into a national crisis." But resolving the issue was easier said than done. Outside, accusations of a cover-up began to surface. Some alleged that the local police force was deliberately delaying the investigation to protect its reputation. "People are asking why Ryan hasn't been officially suspended yet," one advisor reminded. "If we don't take concrete action, they'll think we're siding with him." Meanwhile, Police Chief Henry Collins, a man who had once worked under Ryan's father, faced internal pressure as well. Some younger officers in the department began questioning the fairness of his handling of the case, while older officers remained supportive of Ryan. Across town, Ryan sat alone in his dark living room, the flickering light from the TV casting shadows across his face. On the screen, clips of him and William replayed on the news. He turned off the TV, but the silence only amplified the sound of chants from the protests outside. His phone vibrated incessantly on the table, filled with messages and missed calls. Some were from friends and family urging him to stay calm, while others were laced with threats, accusations, and insults. Ryan looked down at his hands, recalling the moment his boot struck William's body. A faint sense of regret began to creep in, but fear and pride kept him from fully acknowledging it. Down the street, a neighbor quietly texted him, "Ryan, you need to prepare for the town hall meeting. The entire town will be there to hear your explanation. Don't make things worse." Ryan sighed. Deep down, he knew the situation had spiraled beyond his control. But what he didn't yet realize was that the meeting wouldn't just be a confrontation with the community. It would also force him to confront himself. The morning after the first protest, Ryan Mitchell sat silently on the couch in his small apartment. The dim light filtering through the window couldn't mask the chaos in his mind. Messages, missed calls, and threats flooded his phone. Some labeled him a racist, while others bluntly demanded his resignation. The whole town now knew his name, but not in the way he had ever wanted. A knock on the door startled Ryan. It was a former colleague carrying an official notice from the police department. "Ryan," the colleague said, his face uneasy, "you're being placed on suspension. It's temporary, pending the investigation, but—" Ryan didn't need to hear the rest. "But what?" he interrupted, his voice tense. "But don't count on coming back if public pressure stays like this," the colleague replied, avoiding Ryan's gaze. Ryan took the paper without a word. When the door shut, he collapsed back onto the couch. The sense of isolation weighed on him more heavily than ever. He checked his phone. A message from his mother appeared. "Don't bother calling home. Your father doesn't want to talk to you right now." His mother had always been the one to soften his father's rigidity, but this time even she was powerless. Ryan wasn't someone who easily showed emotion, but today he felt stripped bare. The image of William standing back up, slowly but with unyielding determination, lingered in his mind. For the first time in years, Ryan began to ask himself, was I doing the right thing? He tried to justify his actions, leaning on excuses like it was professional instinct or I was just doing my duty. But those reasons now felt hollow. The image of William hitting the ground, his groceries scattering, refused to leave Ryan's mind. Deep down, he knew he had been wrong, but he had no idea where to start in facing that truth. In his confusion, a memory suddenly resurfaced. A memory Ryan had tried to forget. A few years earlier, as a young officer, Ryan had encountered a difficult situation during a late-night shift. A small fire had broken out in an old residential building. Ryan was the first to arrive at the scene, but he froze, unsure of how to handle the emergency. As he panicked, an older man appeared, calm and composed, guiding him on how to evacuate the people trapped inside. That man was none other than William Carter. At the time, Ryan hadn't known his name or thought much about the man wearing a hat with the words Vietnam Veteran stitched on it. He only remembered the steady gaze and firm voice as William said, "No one gets left behind. Follow me." Ryan had followed his instructions, and thanks to William, no one was seriously injured. But instead of feeling gratitude, Ryan had been embarrassed to accept help from a stranger. He hadn't even thanked William, leaving quietly once the fire department arrived. Now, as the memory resurfaced, Ryan realized the bitter irony. The man he had once dismissed was the same person who had saved him from failure early in his career. He looked around his apartment, feeling the weight of loneliness and shame more heavily than ever. He asked himself, have I become the person my father always wanted me to be, or the person I once swore I'd never become? But the answer didn't come easily. Ryan sat there in the dark, confronting the truth that he had lost not only his career, but also his faith in himself. On the table, the suspension notice lay next to an old handwritten letter, a letter Ryan had never read, sent by his father after their last major argument. Outside, the chants of protesters continued to echo, refusing to let him escape from the reality he had created. Ryan knew it was time to make a decision that would not only shape his life moving forward, but also redefine how he saw himself and the world around him. The town center clock chimed 7 p.m., its echoes resonating through the tense atmosphere of the once peaceful small town. The lights of the town hall glowed brightly, like a beacon amid the unease. Outside, groups of protesters gathered in clusters, holding up opposing signs and slogans. Inside, the hall was packed. Residents, journalists, and social activists filled every seat. Ryan Mitchell entered slowly, feeling as though the room, crammed with people, was collectively holding its breath. Dressed in plain clothes, a simple button-down shirt and jeans, Ryan was far from the image of authority his police uniform once conveyed. Tonight, he appeared as an ordinary man walking into a battle he knew was not in his favor. Sitting in the back row, William Carter watched quietly. He didn't need to say or do anything. His presence alone was enough to command the room. The familiar Vietnam veteran hat rested neatly in his hands, a symbol of the resilience he had carried throughout his life. The murmurs grew louder as eyes turned to Ryan, their gazes a mixture of criticism and curiosity. The town council sat at the front of the room, a microphone positioned in the center of their table. "We are here tonight to address the controversial incident that occurred last week," a female council representative began. "Both Mr. William Carter and Officer Ryan Mitchell are present to share their perspectives." William rose to his feet. His slow, deliberate steps echoed on the tiled floor, each one carrying the weight of a life lived through pain and perseverance. As he approached the microphone, the room fell silent as though everyone had collectively stopped breathing. "I'm not one to make a fuss," William began, his voice deep and measured. "But there are times when silence is no longer an option." He paused, his gaze sweeping the crowd before resting on Ryan for a long, deliberate moment. "Last week, I was kicked to the ground. Not just by one person, but by a system that has been in place for far too long. A system that says someone like me, a black man, a veteran, isn't worthy of respect. But I am here to tell you that I didn't stand back up just for myself. I stood up for everyone who has ever been treated like I was." The hall was silent, save for the scribbling of a journalist's pen against paper. "You know," William continued, his voice cracking slightly, "when I came back from the war, I thought I had paid enough to earn equality. But then I realized the battlefield at home was even harsher. The suspicious looks, the doors slammed in my face. And last week, it all came rushing back when I found myself on the ground, looking up at someone who was supposed to protect me." The room seemed ready to erupt, but William raised his hand, calling for silence. "But I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for justice. And justice isn't just an apology. Justice is change." He stepped away from the microphone and returned to his seat, the room erupting into thunderous applause. Ryan sat, each of William's words cutting deeply into him. When the council called his name, he knew he couldn't avoid it any longer. He walked to the front, his hands clenched to stop them from trembling. Standing at the microphone, he looked out at the crowd, then turned to face William. "I don't know where to begin," he started, his voice rough. "Maybe because I've never had to stand in front of someone and admit I was wrong." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Last week, I did something I cannot justify. I have no excuses. My actions were wrong, and I know that. I didn't just hurt Mr. Carter. I betrayed the very values I swore to uphold." Ryan turned to William, meeting his gaze for the first time since the incident. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. I'm sorry for not valuing you, and for letting prejudice guide my actions. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I needed to say this." He turned back to the audience. "And to all of you, I know that an apology isn't enough, but I want you to know that I won't avoid accountability. I will do everything I can to make amends." Ryan's words hung in the air, the room heavy with tension. Some nodded, acknowledging his honesty, while whispers of doubt began to ripple through the crowd. Words are easy. What about action? He's just saying this to save his reputation. The murmurs grew louder until a man stood up and shouted, "An apology isn't enough. William deserves more." Cheers and jeers intermingled, plunging the hall into chaos. Ryan lowered his head, feeling the weight of the room pressing down on him. But when he glanced at William, the older man remained seated, silently observing him with an unreadable expression. The council chair's gavel banged loudly, trying to restore order. But in Ryan's heart, he knew his apology was only the first step. He had to face not only the community but also the person he had become. The chaos of the previous night's town hall meeting still echoed in William Carter's mind as he woke up the next morning. Weak sunlight filtered through the small window, casting a soft glow on his weathered face. His Vietnam veteran hat rested neatly on the kitchen table, a silent reminder of the values he had upheld throughout his life. But today, William felt a new weight on his heart. Not from Ryan's kick, but from the chance outside his window. Outside William's home, a group had gathered early in the morning. They held signs high, their slogans bold: "Take it to court," "End Ryan Mitchell's career," "William, we stand with you." Peeking through the curtains, William saw familiar faces among the crowd. Some were neighbors who had greeted him every morning. Others were strangers, perhaps from nearby towns. A knock on the door startled him. When William opened it, a middle-aged man with a determined demeanor stepped inside. Introducing himself as Paul Hampton, a well-known social activist, Paul wasted no time getting to the point. "Mr. Carter, this is our chance to send a powerful message. Ryan Mitchell didn't just kick you, he kicked the entire community. We need to take him to court and make him pay." William didn't respond immediately. He invited Paul to sit, but the man's presence seemed to make the small kitchen feel even smaller. Paul continued, "We have lawyers ready to support you. They won't stop at just getting him suspended. We'll ruin his career so no one dares to do this again." William listened carefully, but a sense of unease crept over him. After Paul left, William sat silently at the kitchen table, his aged hands clasped together. Paul's words echoed in his mind, but not in the way William had hoped. William knew Ryan had been wrong. The kick had knocked him to the ground, not just physically but emotionally, wounding his pride. Yet, would destroying Ryan's career bring justice, or would it simply be revenge? Memories from the battlefield flooded back. William recalled young soldiers who had made mistakes out of fear, ignorance, or their inability to confront what was inside them. He didn't want to be the one to drag another life further into despair. But the pressure from the community was real. The chants outside his window, the supportive messages and the calls for vengeance left him feeling torn. That evening, as things quieted down, William's 10-year-old granddaughter, Emily, came to visit. She brought with her a handmade card that read, "You're my hero, Grandpa." William smiled softly at the card, but his eyes remained thoughtful. Emily noticed and sat beside him. "Grandpa," she said gently, "I heard the people outside saying you should make the police officer pay. Do you regret standing up?" Emily's question made William pause. He looked into her innocent eyes, searching for the answer within himself. "No, Emily," William said, his voice steady but firm. "I don't regret standing up. But I don't want to use that stand to harm someone else. Justice isn't about revenge, do you understand?" Emily nodded, though curiosity lingered in her expression. "So, what will you do?" she asked. William quietly gazed out the window, where the street lights illuminated the protest signs still standing outside his home. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I'll do what's right." That night, William sat at the table, writing his thoughts down. He decided he would make his stance clear at the next community meeting. This time, he wouldn't let anger or vengeance guide him. As William folded the letter, he felt a slight sense of relief. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready to face it. Not because of pressure from others, but because of his unwavering belief in doing what was right. The morning sunlight streamed through the window of William's home, illuminating the letter he had written the night before. Outside, the crowd of protesters had thinned, but the tension in the town lingered. William sat at his kitchen table, cradling a cup of hot coffee, his heart weighed down by conflicting emotions. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of Thompson's grocery, a young employee sat silently, staring at her phone. Linda Hayes, a cashier at the store, had witnessed the entire incident that day. Linda felt compelled to speak up. She had remained silent for too long but could no longer stand by as the situation spiraled out of control. Not only had Linda witnessed Ryan's kick, but she had also overheard what he said immediately afterward. That day, as Ryan walked away from William, Linda had heard him mutter to a fellow officer who had just arrived at the scene, "I shouldn't have done that. I need to apologize right away." However, his colleague, a senior officer, stopped him, saying, "Don't do anything stupid, Mitchell. Just stay quiet and let me handle it." Linda remembered the unease on Ryan's face, but also noted that he had said nothing further. She realized she held a crucial piece of the story, one that could shift the community's perception of Ryan. Determined, Linda decided to go to the town hall, carrying a short recording she had unintentionally captured on her phone. At the next community meeting, she stepped forward, her face pale, but her eyes resolute. "Excuse me," Linda began, her voice trembling but clear. "I'm an employee at Thompson's Grocery, and I think everyone here deserves to know the truth." The room fell silent as Linda pulled out her phone and played the recording. Ryan's voice came through, filled with worry. "I shouldn't have done that. I need to apologize right away." Then came the voice of his superior, cold and firm. "Don't do anything stupid, Mitchell. Just stay quiet and let me handle it." The room collectively held its breath. When the recording ended, murmurs spread through the audience. Some in the room seemed moved by the evidence. "If he wanted to apologize, maybe he's not as bad as we thought," one woman said gently. "An apology doesn't change the fact that he kicked Mr. Carter," another man retorted. The room erupted into debates, dividing the crowd into two clear sides. Those who began to empathize with Ryan, believing he had been pressured by his superior and prevented from making amends, and those who maintained that his actions were inexcusable regardless. Amid the commotion, Ryan sat in a corner of the room, his exhaustion evident but tinged with a faint sense of relief. He hadn't known Linda had recorded the exchange, and this revelation, however small, felt like a glimmer of light in the darkness that surrounded him. At the front row, William sat silently, gripping his Vietnam veteran hat tightly. He listened to the recording, and a vague feeling crept into his heart. Ryan wanted to apologize. What does that mean? When the meeting ended, William walked home in silence. The questions lingered in his mind. Is Ryan truly remorseful, or is he simply reacting to the pressure of his circumstances? William knew he needed time to process everything, but he also realized one thing. This situation was far more complicated than it seemed. Elsewhere in town, Ryan sat in his dark apartment, replaying the recording over and over. He felt a small weight lifted from his chest, but understood that the recording couldn't erase what he had done. Ryan knew his journey to redemption had only just begun, and now he had to confront himself, without any excuses left to hide behind. The late-night streetlights cast shadows of old trees against the small house of William Carter. The house was quiet, much like its owner, but inside William remained awake, sitting pensively at his kitchen table. Since the community meeting the day before, he had spent most of his time reflecting. Every word, every murmur from the gathering lingered in his mind. Suddenly, a soft knock broke the silence. William looked up, his brow furrowed. Who would visit at this hour? He walked slowly to the door, his hand gripping the doorknob as though bracing for the unexpected. When he opened the door, there stood Ryan Mitchell. Gone was the arrogance. Gone was the air of authority. Ryan looked like a different man, exhausted and tense, but with an earnestness in his eyes that William hadn't seen before. "Mr. Carter," Ryan began, his voice low and hoarse. "I know this isn't a good time, but I need to talk to you. I need to apologize." William stared at Ryan for a long moment, as though assessing the sincerity of his words. Finally, he opened the door wider, gesturing for Ryan to come in. "Sit down," William said, his tone calm but not entirely welcoming. Ryan sat on an old wooden chair, his hands clasped tightly together, unsure of how to begin. William leaned against the sink, his gaze steady and unyielding. "I don't know how to say this," Ryan spoke after a long silence, "but I want you to know I regret what I did. I don't hate you. I never did. I didn't know how to control myself." William's brow furrowed, but he remained silent, letting Ryan continue. "I didn't kick you because you did anything wrong. I kicked you because I was angry, but not at you. I've been fighting myself, fighting everything I carry from my past. And you were just there in front of me at that moment." Ryan lowered his head, his voice breaking. "I was wrong. There's no excuse for what I did. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I truly want to change." William took a deep breath, his gaze softening slightly. He pulled out a chair and sat across from Ryan, meeting his eyes directly. "Mr. Mitchell," William began, his voice deliberate and firm, "you're right not to ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't something you can demand, it has to be given. And to be given, you have to prove you deserve it." Ryan lifted his head, his eyes meeting William's. "Redemption," William continued, "doesn't come from words. It comes from actions. Every day and everything you do. And not to satisfy me, but so you can look in the mirror and see a better man." William paused, his steady gaze never leaving Ryan. "I've lived long enough to know that everyone makes mistakes. But what matters is what they do after realizing those mistakes. What are you going to do to change, Mitchell?" Ryan sat in silence for a moment before exhaling deeply, as though releasing a burden he had carried for years. "I don't hate you, Mr. Carter," Ryan said, his voice trembling. "I hate myself. I hate the way I was raised, the way I've seen the world through the lens my father forced on me. I've always felt insecure, always afraid that if I didn't act strong, didn't make others fear me, I'd be nothing." He paused, his reddened eyes locking onto William's. "But I realize now that I was wrong. I don't want to live like that anymore. I don't want to be that man." William studied Ryan, sensing the sincerity in his words. He nodded slightly, but offered no forgiveness. "Then start," William said, his voice firm. "You don't need to prove anything to me. Prove to yourself that you can do the right thing." Ryan stood, his eyes showing a resolve he had never felt before. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," he said, his voice quiet but filled with genuine gratitude. William didn't respond, only nodded, but his gaze had softened. As Ryan walked out the door, William watched his figure fade into the night. William knew this conversation wasn't the end, but the beginning of a new journey, for both Ryan and himself. The morning after his conversation with William, Ryan Mitchell woke up with an unfamiliar feeling. It wasn't the usual fear or anger, but a fragile sense of relief. He knew he had taken the first step on his path to redemption, but it was only the beginning. Ryan walked into the police station, a place he had once proudly called home, but today everything felt different. He could feel the scrutinizing gazes of his colleagues as he made his way down the hallway. Some whispered, while others turned away to avoid meeting his eyes. Stopping at the door of Police Chief Henry Collins' office, Ryan took a deep breath before knocking. "Come in," Collins' gruff voice called from inside. Ryan stepped in and placed a letter on the desk. "I'm resigning," he said firmly. Collins looked up, his sharp eyes betraying a hint of disappointment. "You know this won't change anything, right?" Ryan nodded. "I know. But it's the right thing to do. I can't keep wearing this uniform knowing I've caused harm." Collins studied him for a long moment before letting out a sigh. "I don't agree with how you're handling this, Mitchell. But if this is the path you've chosen, I wish you luck." That evening, Ryan appeared at a community meeting. Standing before the crowd, his heart pounded. Not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. "I've resigned," Ryan began, his voice steady in the silent room. "I don't deserve to wear that uniform anymore, but I want you all to know I'm not giving up on the fight to be a better person." He paused, scanning the crowd until his eyes met Williams. "I hurt not just one man, but an entire community. I'm sorry, and I'm not saying this to seek forgiveness, but to begin taking action." Ryan continued, outlining his plan. "I will work to develop a new training program for police officers, a program focused on respect and understanding of the community. I can't change what happened, but I can try to prevent it from happening again." His words didn't win over everyone. Some in the audience still looked at him with skepticism, but others began to nod, quietly acknowledging his sincerity. Ryan's decision to resign and his public apology elicited reactions not only from the community, but also from his personal life. Former friends in the police force, people who had once stood by his side, now avoided him. Some even sent accusatory messages, calling him a traitor. "Why are you siding with them?" one former colleague texted. "We were your family, and you turned your back on us." Ryan read the words, his heart heavy, but he understood that change was never easy. Ryan began working with a small group of activists and community relations experts. Together, they developed a new training program for police officers, emphasizing listening, empathy, and respect for diversity. He spent time visiting neighborhoods, meeting and talking with residents to better understand what they needed from law enforcement. The conversations were not always smooth. Many still harbored doubts about him, but Ryan persevered. William, while not directly involved, quietly observed Ryan's efforts. He didn't offer praise, but his gaze when looking at Ryan no longer held anger. Instead, there was a glimmer of hope. One afternoon, as Ryan prepared for another community meeting, he received a letter from William. "Mitchell," the letter read, "I doubted you, and I still think you have a long way to go to prove yourself. But I see your effort. Keep going. Don't stop." Ryan held the letter, a faint smile forming on his lips. It wasn't full forgiveness, but it was a sign, a small light in the long path of redemption he was walking. Ryan Mitchell gazed out the window of his small apartment, the morning sunlight illuminating the quiet streets of the town. He placed William's letter down on the table, his heart filled with determination. His journey of redemption was no longer just about personal change. It was an opportunity to contribute to healing the community he had once unintentionally hurt. Change didn't happen overnight, but small steps began to take shape within the town. William Carter, with his calm demeanor and life experience, began participating in discussions at churches, libraries, and community centers, places where people gathered to talk about sensitive issues they had previously avoided. At a meeting in the local church, William stood before a group, his eyes scanning the room. He began, We can't change the past, but we can learn from it. I'm not here to place blame or shame anyone. I'm here to say this. It's time we start listening to each other." His simple but powerful words sparked a deep discussion among the attendees. A young woman raised her hand, sharing how she had often felt isolated because of her skin color. A middle-aged man, a police officer, also spoke up. "We're not perfect, but I believe that, with the right guidance, we can do better." Conversations like these not only helped to dispel misunderstandings, but also fostered understanding among groups of people who had seemed irreconcilably divided. Inspired by these discussions, a group of residents, including both Ryan and William, came together to establish a charitable foundation called New Hope. The foundation's mission was to support individuals who had faced injustice, particularly veterans like William, people who had sacrificed so much but hadn't received the recognition they deserved. The foundation launched programs such as financial assistance for struggling veterans, workshops to raise awareness about equality and social justice, scholarships for children from disadvantaged families. Ryan, though no longer a police officer, became actively involved in the foundation's initiatives. He frequently attended meetings and events, helping to connect the foundation with external funding sources. One afternoon, during a fundraising event, William stood beside Ryan as they watched the crowd mingling and laughing. "You've done well," William said, his voice warm. Ryan turned to him, offering a small smile. "I'm just doing what needs to be done, but there's still a long way to go." William nodded. "We all do." The tireless efforts of Ryan, William, and the community began to yield results. In the town square, tensions eased. Groups that had once stood on opposite sides during protests now sat at the same table, discussing ways to improve their shared lives. Even Police Chief Henry Collins, initially cold toward Ryan's efforts, eventually joined the discussions. "We can't erase our mistakes, but we can fix them," he said during a large meeting at the library. Small but significant changes began to emerge. The police force participated in training sessions focused on respect and understanding of the community. Local schools introduced programs on equality and the value of diversity. A memorial wall honoring veterans was erected in the town square with William Carter's name prominently engraved. That evening, William sat on his porch, gazing at the town lights glowing brightly. Ryan visited him, carrying a report on the foundation's progress. "Do you think we're on the right path?" Ryan asked, his voice thoughtful. William looked at him, his eyes glinting softly in the dim light. "You know, Mitchell, change is never perfect. But what matters is that we've started, and sometimes just starting is enough." Ryan nodded, feeling a newfound sense of ease. He knew their journey was far from over, but he no longer felt alone. The night had fallen over the small town, and the street lights cast their glow on the quiet streets. Inside William Carter's house, the soft light from a desk lamp illuminated the room, casting shadows on the framed certificates and mementos hanging on the walls. William sat at the kitchen table, engrossed in a book. The atmosphere was peaceful, broken only by the steady ticking of the clock. Suddenly, a knock at the door shattered the silence. William lifted his head, his brow furrowing in his usual manner. He rose slowly, heading to the door, his hand gripping the doorknob as if bracing for the unexpected. When he opened it, he was not entirely surprised to see Ryan Mitchell standing there. "Mitchell," William said, his voice calm but tinged with firmness. "You again. What do you want this time?" Ryan gave a faint smile, holding a thick folder in his hand. "I have something I'd like you to see," he said, his tone resolute. William invited Ryan inside, this time without much hesitation. Ryan placed the folder on the table and sat across from him, his expression serious. "This is the detailed plan for a police reform program I've been working on for the past few months," Ryan explained as he opened the folder. "I want you to look it over and tell me what you think. If there are gaps, I need to know. If anything is missing, I'll fix it." William studied Ryan for a long moment, his sharp gaze probing as if trying to discern whether Ryan was truly earnest. Finally, he picked up the folder and began flipping through the pages. The plan was more thorough than William had anticipated. Ryan had included significant measures such as training on cultural awareness and the history of the communities served by law enforcement, improvements in recruitment processes, focusing on candidates with strong empathy and communication skills, establishing an independent oversight committee comprising residents and experts. William read each page with meticulous attention. Occasionally, he paused, looking up at Ryan, but he said nothing. Ryan sat quietly, his hands clasped together on the table, waiting for the judgment of the man across from him. When William finished, he placed the folder back on the table and looked directly at Ryan. "You're serious about this?" William said, his voice low but no longer icy. Ryan nodded. "I am. I know I was wrong, and I'm not asking for easy forgiveness, but I want to make sure that mistakes like mine don't happen again, at least not in this town." William remained silent for a moment, his expression contemplative. Finally, he exhaled deeply. "Mitchell, I can't say that I've forgiven you. Forgiveness is a long road and we're still walking it," William said, "but I see your effort. I see you're trying, and that's worth encouraging." Ryan bowed his head slightly, feeling both relief and the weight of responsibility. William picked up the folder again, tapping his fingers lightly on the cover. "You've got a solid plan here, but the most important thing is action. You have to prove that what you've written isn't just words." Ryan nodded firmly. "I understand, and I'll work to prove it, not just to you but to this entire town." William offered a rare but genuine smile. "Good. Now, let's get started, Mitchell. Neither of us is getting any younger, and there's no time to waste." Ryan stood up, thanking William before leaving. As he walked away from the house, he felt as though he had crossed an important threshold. William stood in the doorway, watching Ryan until he disappeared into the night. A faint sense of hope began to stir in William's heart. Perhaps people could change. Back in his apartment, Ryan reopened the plan, deeply aware that it was more than just a document. It was a commitment, a promise to his community, to William, and to his conscience. With William's quiet endorsement, Ryan knew he had taken a significant first step. But he also understood that real change would require more: consistent action and unwavering perseverance over the long haul. The morning sun bathed the small town streets in soft golden light. In the town square, residents gathered around a newly erected wall honoring veterans who had sacrificed for their country and individuals who had fought for justice. William Carter's name was prominently etched on the wall, a lasting reminder of perseverance and the relentless pursuit of what is right. William stood silently before the wall, his weathered hand gently tracing the engraved letters of his name. Behind him, the murmurs of townspeople filled the air, no longer tense or divided, but harmonious and reflective. Since the events that had shaken the town, William had become a symbol of unity and justice. People honored him not only for what he endured, but also for how he faced his pain without letting it turn into vengeance. At community discussions, William often stood to speak, his voice steady and warm yet commanding. Justice is not about revenge. It is an opportunity to do what is right, not just for oneself, but for the entire community. He emphasized that real change required collective effort, not the actions of one individual. His words, though simple, became guiding principles for the town. Ryan Mitchell, no longer the embodiment of arrogance and unchecked power that once haunted the community, had transformed into a symbol of redemption and the determination to change. The police reform program Ryan initiated had begun to take root. Officers in the town now attended training sessions focused on listening to and respecting the communities they served. Ryan wasn't just behind the scenes directing the effort. He actively participated, listening to stories from residents and learning from them. However, challenges persisted. Some still harbored doubts about Ryan's transformation, but he did not let skepticism deter him. He understood that his journey wasn't about convincing everyone, but about proving his sincerity through consistent action. In the months following, the town, once deeply divided, gradually rediscovered unity. Discussions at churches, libraries, and community centers shifted from tension to sharing and understanding. A charitable foundation named New Hope was established, supporting not only veterans but also educational programs on equality and social justice. Small but meaningful actions began to reshape the town's mindset. One quiet evening, Ryan visited William. The two men, who had once stood on opposite sides of a bitter divide, now sat together on William's porch, watching the warm yellow streetlights cast a gentle glow on the streets below. "Mr. Carter," Ryan said, breaking the silence, "do you think I can ever do enough to make up for what I've done?" William didn't respond immediately. He sipped his hot tea, his gaze distant before he turned to Ryan. "Mitchell," he began slowly, "atonement isn't something you should focus on. What you need to do is ensure that every day you live is a day done right. Justice isn't a destination. It's a journey." Ryan nodded, his eyes reflecting a newfound determination. He understood that William's words weren't just advice, they were an undeniable truth. As Ryan stood to leave, William watched him fade into the dim light of the evening. A faint, almost imperceptible smile crossed William's weathered face. Their story, one of mistakes, pain, and healing, was not just a lesson for the two of them, but a message for the entire community. Justice isn't revenge. It's the chance to do what is right. And for change to truly matter, it takes an entire community striving together. The small town, once torn apart by prejudice and mistakes, had found a new glimmer of hope, a fresh beginning. This story isn't just about a man seeking redemption or another fighting for justice. It's about transformation, patience, and the power of community. Ryan Mitchell chose to act to make things right, and William Carter chose to resolve resentment. What about you? If you were in William's position, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you more meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.